Hi everyone, welcome to the IPE week. We're going to sort of look into a branch of international relations now that international political economy that sort of becomes bigger in the 1970s. Remember at the beginning of the semester when we were discussing, what is international relations? We start off, international relations starts off as, along with realism as the beginning of a study of power. A study of politics, international politics, but particularly conflict and war. Right, power in the early days of international relations seemed to be connected very closely to conflict and to war. Relative power of different states and the ability of states to exist, to continue to exist, to survive. And survival meant, especially in those early days, it meant being able to withstand attacks, military attacks, or threat of military force from outside, and being able to exert that in order to extend your foreign policy. Remember, this is just after the Second World War. E.H. Carr's writing in between the wars, but Morgenthau's writing after the Second World War. So, international relations, as we know it today, as an academic discipline, begins very close to, around the Second World War, having just fought two big wars, interstate wars between states. So state survival, conflict, war, that was the key. After a few decades, the discipline grows, right? More and more scholars enter the discipline. This is my sort of, I suppose, careerist explanation about where IPE comes from. But, as the discipline grows, as more and more scholars enter the field, we can't all study we can't all study conflict or security or strategy, right? Or nuclear deterrent strategy or anything like that. It's got to grow. And so one of the places that it grows into is international political economy. And what I'm already doing now in this introduction is answering a couple of questions from you. One of them is the international political economy, IPE, is referred to as a study that was not popular in the 1970s when exploration of the topic started. But how much has it grown since then? Is the job market big for international political economists? And then I'm going to take these two together. The next one is what is IPE? Is it the same as economy, but with international relations taken into consideration? Does it also refer to interdisciplinary academic discipline that analyzes economics, politics, and international relations? I think yes, broadly yes, to all of those things. It has grown. It is pretty prominent. I think international political economy is a great subfield, sort of subfield, a great part of international relations to get into. It's not mine, right? So I'm saying this as very much as an outsider, as somebody who's read certainly some basics, but not specialized in it. And so it's hard for me to gauge exactly whether there's a large job market for it, but they do seem to be in high demand, right? Scholars that understand economics and can apply that knowledge of economics to international politics. I wonder, and again, this is sort of a sort of professional, the question pushes us this way, which is fair enough. But sort of professional development capacity, if you're interested in getting into the field of international relations and you're wondering what part of international relations to go into, one of the considerations is if you have a strong basis in understanding in economics, there might be more lucrative directions to go, right, than to apply that to international relations, which has got to be, perhaps one reason why there is maybe a big demand, right, for economists in international relations. There's definitely big parts of international relations, sort of mainstream international relations that uses the methodology or wants to co-opt the methodology of economics. So again, even going into other parts of international relations, having an understanding of economic methods might be quite useful for you if you're thinking sort of career-wise in the job market. So yeah, it's definitely an established field, a well-established subfield, right? A field of international relations, and again, basically, it's harnessing the methodology of economics, but also the focus on economics. So remember, we said at the beginning, or I said, At the beginning of international relations, we have conflict, we have war, we have strategy, right? Stuff to do with armies and militaries and conflict and survival and that sort of thing. That carries on today, and we talk about security studies, and it's broadened quite a lot. Security studies has broadened from sort of military security to other types of security as well. So that still persists today, study of conflict and of security. But what also persists now since the 1970s is, hey, we're not going to look at war, we're not going to look at conflict, military conflict and the threat of war, the threat of violence. What we're going to do is look at economic relations between nation states, because people who do that will argue that there's a lot more of that going on, right, than there is of conflict, right, of war. It talks about complex interdependence. That's I think we can sort of introduce that here and talk about it. It's introduced by Keohane in the book, but we can talk about maybe one of the reasons why we don't see as much armed conflict, right, is because we're all interdependent now. Complex interdependence in a number of sectors of the economy and on a number of levels, right, state level, company level, international organization level. The world is becoming more interconnected. We have deals, we have trade deals on different levels. Economic relationships all around the world, webs of international economic relationships with as I said, between states, between other economic units, right, like companies and firms and unions as well. That would be another way, another place to look at and still be in international political economy. Relationships between unions across the world and how that affects economic production. But again, all of this, we're studying those things in IPE, but we're doing it and always asking ourselves the question, how does that affect relations between states? Because we're still international relations. So that's that. Complex interdependence, I briefly explained that. It's in the book. There was another question I think we'll get to a little bit later on. But I think we've covered those first couple of questions about what is IPE? Is it a growth area within international relations? I think it is. Those sorts of skills are in high demand. It's a big job market. You probably, if you're going to become, if you're that interested in economics, you might be tempted to become an economist, right? And perhaps earn more money that way. But certainly there's ways to transfer backwards and forwards between those two fields, both in academia but also professionally, and from professional to academia. Not that academics are professionals too, but practitioners, I suppose, is what I mean. Maybe international organizations, I'm thinking about that sort of thing. And then what is it, right? We've talked about, yes. And now these other couple of questions about Keohane. It says, Robert O. Keohane talks a lot about how much of the world's population has had drastic economic development. Right? So economic development is absolutely part of IPE. Why has parts of Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa failed to rapidly develop like China and India? I can't believe I chose this question. I don't know what the answer to that is. Keohane doesn't really tell us either. I'm sure there's a lot of good work on this. I do a class, or I've taught it twice now. It's not my favorite one, but it is quite, it's probably very IPE, right? It's about economic development. I think it's called Global Inequalities in International Relations. And so I focus mostly on development. And so I've looked at this, I've read some things about development, and still I don't have a great answer for this. Why does China, the second question sort of similarly, right? Further, it quotes Keohane, for the first time in human history, genuine economic development is taking place for much of the world's population. Why is this? And the question is, why is this the case? Why couldn't this development happen previously? So there's all sorts of ways to begin to answer this, but I'm going to begin to answer it. And again, acknowledging that I'm not an expert in IPE, but I have read some things about international development. One thing I think that it's difficult to overlook is the transformation of China. China in 1978, I think Keohane says 78, 78 to 80, certainly. undergoes a big transition and starts to come out of the planned economy and go towards a more liberal economy. And why? Well, because the old planned economy wasn't giving them the results that they wanted, right? They were still very, very poor. But two, it was a political decision, right? It was an intentional decision to open up their markets a little bit, to liberalize their markets and to adopt some elements of capitalism and that's only grown. Oftentimes, China used small regions of the country, right, as sort of experimental sort of areas where we can try a bit of capitalism over there, and if it goes wrong, well, we can just shut that part of the country off. That's how Shenzhen grows, right? It's right next to Hong Kong down there. It's quite far away from the capital, but it's near a big port, so we can try that. And Shenzhen has grown from a small fishing village to a dynamic metropolis, the production center of the world. So we have to look at that. We have to look at China in the late 70s, beginning of the 80s, as it's a huge economy, right? Population is huge, the economy is huge, and so that's one place to look and one thing to sort of answer, to go towards. Why now? Why has parts of Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa failed to rapidly develop like China and India? Right, China and India, sort of relative neighbors. China's huge. It also is in a region of the world, right, in East Asia, where you have also Japan. Right, which is already an economic powerhouse, and then it can the influence and the effect of China's growth is felt in the region. Whereas, well, and let's go, I guess, onto Sub-Saharan Africa, which hasn't developed rapidly like China and India. And I suppose that so most of my reading about Sub-Saharan Africa has been in connection with China. Has been in connection with China as sort of as a catalyst for growth in Sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of investment from China, from Chinese firms, from the Chinese government into Sub-Saharan Africa, with sort of the promise of growth, right? China, and I think, this was in another class I do. We read Breslan, who talks about so China seeing itself as really responsible, seeing itself as a member of a developing, like a community of developing states that has found a lot of success, and that now sees it as its duty and its opportunity, right, to bring that economic success, that economic model to Sub-Saharan Africa and to Latin America, and so. My explanation, I think, is very China-based, right? It's that China made that decision, and then it sort of spreads out from there, first to the close neighborhood, right, to East Asia, but then hopefully further abroad, but we haven't reached further abroad yet. The other part of the explanation, I'm still going to go back to the 80s for this, but maybe the end of the 80s. I think it's hard for me growing up at the time I did, and I suppose going to university at the time that I went to university, but it's hard for me not to see sort of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the sort of division between West and East. You had this alternative model, this alternative centrally planned communist model, and there's definitely, I spent a lot of time in Macedonia, and I talked to a lot of people, and the vast majority of people that I spoke to says, no, things were better in the past. Right now, this is just me speaking to people, right? Because I'm not studying economics particularly, but speaking to people there, things were better under communism. So I don't want to be completely say, it was the fault of centrally planned economics, but certainly the end of that form of economics, the end of the Soviet Union, and the even earlier sort of decision by China to move away from that, seems to have united the world and made opportunities for trade and for business that didn't exist before. And certainly I think I think that's the beginnings of an explanation on that, right? I think that's the, you know, the timing's right? Sort of, if we agree with Keohane, if we listen to Keohane, he's talking about this, you know, sort of first time in human history that genuine economic development has taken place for much of the world's population. It coincides with China moving away and the Soviet Union collapsing, and the subsequent economic reforms that took place in two very large economies, certainly in China. You know, India similarly, right? India was a socialist country too at its inception in 1947. It had close relations with the Soviet Union, and so it does. You know, looking at China, it does seem like some sort of victory of capitalism, at least a you know, a temporary victory, right? At least you know, it has had the effect of bringing lots of people out of poverty. I'm still unable, though. I'm still unable to say why sub-Saharan Africa hasn't enjoyed it, other than saying, well, that's further away from the Soviet Union and China especially, you know. But that's the beginnings, I think, of an argument. But it's certainly not. It shouldn't be completely satisfactory at this point. And of course, the Cold War did affect sub-Saharan Africa. The conflict between East and West oftentimes took place there. Yeah, some of the stuff that we read in this other class, in this the global inequalities class that I teach, has to do with, you know, well, it's not inequality, right? But it's the sort of horseshoe of inequality where, you know, eventually, you know, but again, I'm talking about inequality rather than development here, but I guess it goes along the development curve. But as countries develop, inequality increases. And then once development reaches a certain level, then you start to get social services, social safety net, you know, unemployment insurance and those sorts of things. And that starts to even out the inequalities. That doesn't really start, it's interesting, I suppose, but you know, maybe there's some sort of a threshold that we hit, right? That we just need more time in terms of sub-Saharan Africa. But still, you're asking the question, why sub-Saharan Africa and not, you know, why did China not need more time? You know, you can sort of start to talk about, as we did at the beginning of the semester, civilizational differences. But we didn't talk too much about it in terms of economics because, frankly, that might not be any serious effects on economics. Oh, wait. Here's a great answer. We could. Keohane disagrees with it, which is why I guess I haven't mentioned it because I've got the name Keohane in front of me. But we also in that other class read about dependency theory, right? He also mentions here structural. What is it? Well, he talks about sort of periphery, and this is a great explanation, I suppose, right? Where he talks about center and periphery here, or that other question that was in there that I don't see anymore, but about asymmetrical interdependence. And he relates them, Keohane relates those two, but what he says is they appear to have been exaggerated, right? He sort of poo-poos those ideas a little bit because he says, look, China's developing great, India's developing great. Look at Brazil, right? He mentions Brazil as well. These countries are growing really big, so maybe we overdid the interdependence, but the dependency theory. Those are two different things. I talked about interdependence already, but the dependency theory, where the peripheral economies are dependent on the center economies, right? There's a bit of Marxism in there. Certainly, if we talked to Wallerstein, we did discuss this at the beginning of the semester. Now that I remember where I am, it's hard when I'm not seeing you in front of me in the classroom. But we're in 160, right? So we talked about Wallerstein. We talked about those. We talked about the leading industries, right? That remember they had the most profit and the biggest ability to quickly accumulate capital, and where they were situated, right? They were that was the core countries, right? And what we didn't talk about yet, but it's definitely appropriate in the answer to this question, is it's related to that, right? But this idea of core countries, right? They're producing these highly profitable products and services, right? That they're selling and making a ton of money on. But oftentimes the raw materials that they're using to make this, right? Coming from the peripheral countries, in oftentimes sub-Saharan Africa. Something that comes to mind is Kenya. This is, we'd have to explain it. Well, this is kind of an example. It's not the best example, but it's one that comes readily to my mind. Kenya, sub-Saharan Africa. Kenya supplies, I think, like something like 90%. Don't quote me on that. It's close, but it's a made up number. But it's close to almost all, basically, almost all of UK supermarket produce. And so, if you look at that, you know, where's the sort of the value added, right? Where's the bigger margin? Is it in the production of this of the food, or is it in the retailing of the food in the United Kingdom, right? And you would probably find, I imagine, that the profits are going to the UK supermarkets, not to the Kenyan farmers. Yet, because the supermarkets, UK supermarkets, are such a big portion of the business for Kenyan farmers, they are beholden to them, right? They're in the other class we talked about monopsony, right? A monopsony. You've probably heard of monopoly, but monopsony is psonia, which is Greek for buyer, right? So there's just one buyer, and maybe there isn't just one buyer, maybe there's 2 or 3 buyers, right, in terms of UK supermarkets, but very few buyers. And when you have that sort of a situation, you know, you either take what they're going to give you for your produce, or there's no other buyers, right? So you take it or you leave it, right? And you don't have any buyers for your produce, right? So then that gives undue power and influence to the UK supermarkets. And this is a great, this would be a great sort of case study for IPE, one thing to look at, but also economics generally. But, you know, the IPE would ask about the power relationship there, right? Between the UK and Kenya, or between UK supermarkets and Kenya. So there's that. So the idea of corn periphery there is that the thing that the UK supermarkets are producing, right, is more profitable. They keep more of the profits from those carrots than the farmers in Kenya that grew them. You've probably heard of resource curses, right? And you know, countries with raw materials whose economies are based on raw materials, such as oil. Like think of Nigerian oil, for example, if we're talking about sub-Saharan Africa. You know, diamonds, gold, minerals from the ground. They're very valuable, right? Cash crops as well, things like cocoa, very valuable to the to Western markets. But oftentimes the wealth that's gathered from that is usually easy to control by very small elites, and doesn't oftentimes lead to development of the local economy. That's another thing that we talk about in the global inequalities class. So there might be some answers there. That's certainly the beginning of some of the answers, more than Keohane gives us, I think, in this reading. So I'll take that. Hopefully, we've talked a little bit more about what IPE is. There, the Keohane article is a good one to start with. What it does, finally, as I'm leaving, it gives you this sort of some ideas about the topics to study in IPE. You know, what does IPE do? And Keohane's here telling you this is what you should be looking at. These are things that we did, but these are things that have changed since we've done our work, and now it's your turn, right, to carry on. And one of the big things, the reason why we're talking about development, or why he's talking about development, is saying, look, some of these countries that, like China and India, that are coming through now that you really can't ignore anymore, we haven't written anything about, right? So there's a lot of scope there for research in that area. We can't ignore China anymore, right? It's what does he say? An elephant stepping into a small pond. I'll end there. Hopefully you find this helpful, and goodbye for now.